Morning. Morning. Can I do that? Is that all right? Seeing there's no one on the front row, because who wants to be there? Okay. Good morning. Just a kind of little disclaimer. Hi, my name's Nick. If I start crying at some point in the service because I have an eye infection, not necessarily because the Spirit of God is doing anything in me, or because I'm sad that I'm not in the Audi. Yes. As many of you know, I work for Norwich Youth for Christ. It's a great job. And one of the privileges of working there is that we have a big conference once a year where all of the Youth for Christ centres around the country come together, worship and get some teaching. It hasn't happened over the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but a few years ago we went, and Wes Stafford was the main speaker. Wes Stafford was the former CEO of Compassion, which was a kind of child sponsorship organisation, so children in different countries who couldn't afford to go to school, basically they were kind of provided for by people in other more wealthy countries. But he's got a fascinating testimony, and his parents were missionaries in Africa as a boy, and so he kind of, as part of his teaching, he talked about his experiences as a child growing up. And he talks about how all children, even young children, had responsibilities, and that the crops that they were kind of growing often were destroyed by baboons. And so the children would guard the crops with slingshots. So they would sort of stand guard with slingshots. And slingshots, this is very interesting in terms of David and Goliath, slingshots could travel over 70 miles an hour, okay? And if you know how to use one properly, they can hit a bird out of the sky. So many of the children are actually really good at using slingshots. And he kind of learned how to use this skill. And he said if they managed to kill a baboon, then they could roast it and eat it. I've no idea what that tasted like. But so he's telling this story, and then to give an explanation, he pulls out this slingshot, okay? And he starts kind of looping it round and round. This is a group of, 200 or 300 people, okay? He's kind of looping it round, and as he starts looping it round, he explains, don't worry, I'm practicing with a marshmallow. Okay. In fact, he said, I actually forgot to mention this recently at a spring harvest, at a conference, okay, and which worried lots of people. But he then kind of, he spins it round and round and round, faster and faster, and then finally he kind of like releases this, and this marshmallow kind of sails over everybody towards the back of the room, and everyone goes, woo, and claps. But there was a girl who was sat behind me who, I don't know what was going on, but she wasn't listening properly. And she says, did something just fall out? And the guy next to her said, yeah, it was a marshmallow. And she said, they killed baboons with marshmallows. I don't know what she was doing, but she just missed that kind of vital piece of information in there, didn't she? And I don't know whether she was like looking at her phone or doodling on something, but she got distracted and missed what was being said. And I just want to kind of, I suppose, as my intro to what I'm talking about today, just sort of think about that kind of, because we live in an age of distraction. It is so easy to be distracted. I love John Mark Comer, who has written a book called, I can't remember what it's called now. Yes, we did read it here. It's very good. Anyway, I listened to his, the blue and white book. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Look that up on Amazon, the blue and white book. But he had a podcast, and he said he just sort of said, "Can you remember what it was like to be bored? Like, can you remember what that feeling was like? Because we don't really experience that anymore. When you're standing in a queue in Lidl's or Aldi, and there's not much kind of going on, and what do? You kind of pull out your phone." And you scroll, don't you? We just scroll. So we don't experience boredom in the same way. And distractions are everywhere. They come in at every place. Even now, you might be thinking about something else. What are you doing this afternoon? What you're having for lunch, where you're having lunch. Maybe somebody in the room that you need to talk to, that conversation that you need to have. Or you might just be distracted by this room. It's not the normal layout, even to last week. And you might be thinking about the move, or flipping heck, how long is this preacher going to go on for? So it's so easy to be distracted. And the problem with distraction is it means that we take our eyes off of what is important. Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. So, what is our main thing? Well, I guess you could say, simply it's to love God and to love others. But if we wanted to break that down further, then you would look at the Great Commission from Jesus in Matthew 28, where he says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. To help others, to connect with Jesus and help them to follow him, to multiply, to grow more disciples. That's the main thing. That should be our main thing. That should be the church's main thing. So, how are we doing with that? Because there are concerns that the church is dying out. And Dr. John Hayward, a mathematician at the University of South Wales, calculates that the Church of England faces extinction by 2062, which is just 40 years away. Methodists could be gone by the mid-40s. And basically what he did is he researched church attendance figures from 13 different denominations between the year 2000 and 2020 and created something called the R rate. Nothing to do with COVID. The R rate is the reproducible rate. Are they reproducing more followers of Jesus, more disciples? And some churches are. That's the good news. Some churches are, but a lot aren't. And actually, that's a bit kind of like, that seems to be more focused in the UK and in some of the Western world, because in the rest of the world, the church is actually growing. There are more disciples on the earth, more followers of Jesus than there ever have been before. But it seems that in the UK, we are finding this particularly difficult. And part of that is that we're struggling to pass on our faith. We have become distracted, perhaps by new cultural values, historical traditions, internal politics, or even projects that seem good on the surface, but perhaps aren't God's mandate for the church. And as a kind of side note, and this is perhaps why I do the job that I do, we are struggling especially to pass on the faith to the younger generations. In the Talking Jesus report, which came out just this year, 76% of people who decide to become practicing Christians, okay, so people that decide to become practicing Christians, people that either attend church at least like once a month, I think it is, or pray regularly, okay, 76% of people who decide on becoming a practicing Christian, okay, do that by the time they're aged 18, okay? And if you go up to the age of 24, that covers 83% of people. So 83% of Christians do that by the time they're 24. And so my question often is to lots of people is, so what would that look like if your time, your energy, your resources were spent on 76% of people? 76% of young people? No? Let me get that right. What happens if 76% of your time, resources, money were spent on young people? There we go. Okay, that's a challenging thought, right? But that's why I think youth and children's work is so important. Because if that's when the decisions are being made, that's where we've got to reach out. But I want to talk about that whole thing about how do we reach people? How do we do that? How do we make disciples? And this is not necessarily focused on young people. This is looking at everybody. But we're just going to look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20, which is Peter's confession of Christ. So Matthew 16, verse 13 to 20 says this: When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So it's a kind of this interesting exchange between Jesus and Peter. And I just want to kind of pull out 5 things that I think can help us as we consider what does it mean to kind of go and make disciples. And the first one is very simply, we need to build long-term relationships. This incident seems to be the first time that Peter seems to acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yet, it kind of takes around 2 years after he starts to follow Jesus. That's 2 years of following Jesus around, day by day, traveling, listening to his teaching, seeing miracles. Kind of 2 years of quite intense training. And then finally, Peter says, "You are the Christ." Now, maybe he'd known that for a while. Maybe that was kind of percolating around in his head. But it's only now that he verbally acknowledges Jesus is the Son of God. And even then, he doesn't actually truly understand what that means. Because in the following chapter, if we read ahead, he tries to tell Jesus, "No, you won't be crucified, and that won't happen." Okay? And Jesus has to kind of rebuke him and say, "Shut up, Peter." Okay? And when Jesus is crucified, Peter doesn't really understand this was God's plan and goes back to his fishing profession. So it takes 2 years before Peter understands that Jesus is the Son of God, but still he has more to learn to understand what does it mean to be a disciple. I remember one of the first partnership projects that we started with Norwich Youth for Christ when I first started was with a church, and they wanted to reach out to young people. Great. And they funded a youth club, and we did it on a Friday night. So it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours. And after a year, they had a bit of a review, and they said, "Well, it hasn't really worked." "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, there aren't any young people in church. They're not coming on a Sunday." And it's like, what? Like, how do you get to that conclusion? We're like, we've only just started. We've literally only just started. And so what happens is that people are in a rush. You know, if you look at what Jesus did, it takes 2 years, and this is what it takes to get to Peter. But we think we can do it a couple of hours on a Friday night, and we'll get there. And actually, that has nothing to do with biblical discipleship. It has all to do with our Western culture and the speed at which we want to go. See, discipleship is a relational process that takes time. It's a slow, long process. And it often means we need to explain the gospel many, many times. I think on average it's something like 7 times before it makes sense to a person. Can you bring up that image? Sorry, Al, I kind of dumped this on our thing this morning. But this is a model that we use sometimes just to kind of help us to think through what is it that we're trying to do. And it's not groundbreaking in any way, and it's not gospel in terms of, God just does whatever he wants to do, right? But there's kind of like, we try and think of it as like trying to take on people on a journey of faith. And so we start at this building relationships, and then we want to sow seeds, which means we want to sort of tell people a bit about the gospel. And then there's a point where someone really wants to know a bit more, and then we go a bit further with them. Then potentially we have a decision opportunity. Now, what often happens is we think, like, when we get to the decision opportunity, well, we're there, we're done. But, like, no, that's halfway. That's the decision opportunity. This is where potentially, in the power of the sower, the roots can kind of come up and drown people and things get quashed and squashed. So this is the point where we need to be then taking people on. How do we grow in Christ? How do we become close to Christ? How do we become Christ-centered? And Christ-centered is about when you're making everyday decisions with Jesus at the center of that. So that means sometimes you're denying yourself from certain things because of Jesus, and sometimes you're doing certain things because of Jesus. Okay? And this takes time. But we think sometimes we can go from here to here in like 2 seconds. You can't. In some ways, I'm still doing this bit. I'm still working this stuff out. Yeah? So this is a journey, and we need to be willing to journey with people over a long period of time. Now, that doesn't deny the fact that I think, there are always instances, moments where you're just in the right place at the right time, and you just happen to be somewhere on here to help somebody else do something or whatever. I absolutely believe that. But I think if we try and live our life trying to do that in terms of discipleship, then you're trying to do it short term. And you need to think, how do we do this long term? How do we grow disciples in this way? And, Jesus was highly intentional in his relationships. He picked out, the disciples were 12 people, okay? And he picked out 12 to really focus on. Not like crowd. I know he ministered to crowds, but actually the most intense amount of time he spent with 12 people. And out of that 12, only 3. That I'm going to try and memorize and now can't remember. But someone tell me, who were the 3? It's Peter, John, and who's the other one? The other one that I can't remember. I should have written it down here. James. There we go. Okay. So focuses on those, and you see that in instances where he goes up on the mountaintop, and there's a story where he takes them there, and then there's a healing of Jairus' daughter. He takes 3 into the inner room with him there. So he really kind of he has 12 and focuses on 3. All right, so it's okay to just think, who are the 1 or 2 or 3 people that I'm going to really invest into? Okay. There's a young person that we work with, and saw him a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, it's been 7 years. And I was like panicking, because I was like, oh my gosh, there's a really important anniversary that I've forgotten here. Somebody died 7 years ago, oh my gosh. And he said, that was when we first met. And I was like, oh, okay. Cool, good, a few. And so we just sort of chatting about that, and then he just kind of said, I'm trying to pray more at the minute. I've just started praying and trying to pray each day, and that was huge for him, because this is a young person who isn't from a church background, he isn't from a church home, and so it's taken potentially 7 years to get to that place where he's saying, yeah, I'm praying now. Okay, so we need to be building long-term relationships. The second thing is we need to intentionally create opportunities to explore faith. Jesus starts with a question, what are others saying? But then he hones it and focuses on them. What about you? What about you? So Jesus is the most engaging teacher ever. He uses parables, stories, everyday examples, but it's always to communicate truth. And relationship isn't enough if it doesn't reveal truth. Andy Hawthorne, who is the, I don't know what his title is, director of the Message Trust, thank you. He wrote a book called Unleashed Hope. And in it, he talks about the truck of truth. He says that, what we often need to do is we need to build strong bridges between us and people outside of the church. But we need to make sure that they're strong enough to bring the truck of truth across. But he says this, if we build a beautiful, highly polished bridge of kindness and yet never bring the truck of truth across, we haven't got the job done either. In other words, we can spend an awful lot of time making a fantastic relationship, but then we never reveal anything about our faith. Because of the pandemic, a lot of things had to stop for us. But one of the things that we kind of created in that time was a gaming ministry, which is effectively playing computer games online with young people, and it's possibly the most fun I've ever had in my job. And the chair of trustees, Margaret, she said to me recently, she said, "Can I just ask, are you just playing games? Is that all you're doing? Is that a useful use of your time?" And that is absolutely the right question to ask. Why are we doing that? But the purpose is to communicate faith. So one of the platforms I use is something called Twitch, which is a streaming site where I go on, I play computer games, people can watch and they can jump in and chat. But about halfway through, I will always stop. I'll have what we call a verse of the stream, which is just a verse of the day. Bring up a Bible verse, and I'll talk about that for maybe 5 or so minutes. Okay? And there are other things that we do as part of the gaming ministry where we're trying to connect with young people through a medium that they're already on, but then we want to bring truth and opportunities in there. And more recently, I was playing on a game. This is live as well. This is on our stream, and a young person just kind of comes on and says, "Can I play?" "Yeah, fine." So we're playing Fortnite, if you know that game. If you don't, I won't bore you with the details. It's a lot of fun. But he just suddenly goes, I used to go to church. I don't anymore. And then he's asking me questions about what I do. And he says, what's the best thing about your job? And out of that question, I was able to share the fact that I want to see change in young people because I experienced change as a young person. And that change came because of experiencing God in my own life, and that's what I want to see with others. And so I was just able to kind of share my testimony in that way. And then he stayed on, listened to this verse of the stream, and then afterwards said, "Oh yeah, I was just reading that on my phone. I've got a Bible app." So you don't know where this is going, and hopefully again I want to build a long-term relationship with him, but So we need to think about, all the relationships that we have. How can we bring an opportunity to explore faith? And sometimes that is literally, and again, it's just sowing a seed. That might be all it is, and that's okay. I was with a group of guys on Friday night. We play board games together. Okay, you're picking up a theme for me now, aren't you? I'm just a big kid, really. So we're playing board games together, and if you don't know, we Norwich Youth for Christ are having to move office. We don't want to do that. We have to do that because some difficulties, not with the church, but with the building. The building is kind of being moved on. Anyway, so I'm looking for somewhere else. And the guys just they'd spotted my Facebook post I put up about it, and they said, "Oh yeah, what's happening with that?" And I said, so I was talking about it. And then I just suddenly said, because it was kind of like, we don't really want to move, it's really hard. And I said, ultimately, I've got to believe, that God's got something better for me. I believe that God's got a plan. He's got it in control, and the best is yet to come. And that was really all I said. But this is a group of guys who, don't follow Jesus, they're not in church, and I've got to believe sometimes that's just enough. That's just enough just to kind of sow a seed. And hopefully next time I meet up with them, I'm praying for these guys. Whenever I meet with them, play a game, want to have a good fun playing a game. But I also, want an opportunity to sow a seed, to say something. Okay, so that's what I'm praying for. So, and we need to do that individually as a church. How do we create ways for people of all stages of that journey to explore faith? The third thing is to seek revelation from God. Verse 17, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." So Jesus identifies that Peter's confession comes from God's revelation to him. Because we need more than just programs and projects, great ideas. We need God's revelation to people. And we need to pray for this. And this is something that we absolutely can all do. Craig Groeschel says, if you're not dead, you're not done. In other words, God still has a purpose for you. Okay? I was reading about the Hebrides revival recently. If you've not heard of it, it happened between 1949 and 1952, and it was a widespread kind of revival where people became, a huge amount of people suddenly became Christians, this is a kind of little extract I read. As one church meeting was closing, someone hurried up to the preacher to tell him that there was a crowd of people outside the police station, weeping and calling for someone to come and pray with them. And describing the scenes outside the police station, the minister declared, I saw a sight I never thought was possible, something I shall never forget. Under the starlit sky, men and women were kneeling everywhere, by the roadside, outside the cottages, even behind the peat stacks, crying for God to have mercy upon them. But they reckon that revival started with two elderly ladies, Peggy and Christine Smith. Peggy was 84 and blind. Christine was 82 and almost bent double with arthritis. But they prayed. They prayed day and they prayed night. We need to pray for God's revelation to people. But I believe it's more than that. I think we need God's revelation to us as well. In her book, Strengthen the Soul of Your Leadership, Ruth Haley Barton wrote this. Several years ago, during an unusually intense season of ministry, I made a comment to a friend that surprised us both. Before I could censor my thoughts, I heard myself saying, I'm tired of helping other people enjoy God. I just want to enjoy God for myself. This was both surprising and alarming, because what I was really saying was that my leadership, which usually flows from what is going on in my own soul, was at that moment disconnected from the reality of God in my own life. And again, so easy to do. We get wrapped up in what we are doing for him that we miss out on him. And she concludes that chapter that says that one of the things I know for sure is that those who are looking to us for spiritual sustenance need us first and foremost to be spiritual seekers ourselves. They need us to keep searching for the bread of life that feeds our own souls, so that we can guide them to places of sustenance for their own souls. Then, rather than offering the cold stone of past devotionals, regurgitated apologetics, or someone else's musings about the spiritual life, we will have bread to offer that is warm from the oven of our intimacy with God. Good? Yeah. It's challenging, isn't it? Yeah? Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds his house, those who build it labor in vain. Yeah? So it's not enough just to do all the right things and to have the right programs. We need fresh revelation of who God is in our own lives, and we need to pray for it in the lives of others. The fourth one is that we offer a new identity in Christ. And I in some ways, I apologize because I'm going to overlap a little bit with Jim, but maybe I kind of say this is good because I think it complements as well. But verse 18 and 19 says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So is Jesus saying that he will build his church on Peter himself, that he was elevated among the other disciples? Well, Peter never thought so, because in his letter, 1 Peter chapter 2, he quotes Isaiah that Jesus is the cornerstone. So Peter never thought that. Okay, Jesus was whom the church was built. So what does Jesus actually mean? Okay, well, there's some interesting wordplay that's actually going on here. And so kind of indulge me in a little bit of Greek from what little I know. The original language reveals that Peter's name comes from the Greek word petros, which means a solitary rock or stone. But when Jesus says, on this rock, the rock in the verse comes from petra, which means bedrock or rock, something that you would build on. So Petros, Peter, Petros, small solitary stone. Okay, Patra, bedrock, where you stand on. Okay, and so Jesus is saying that you are a solitary stone, but on this bedrock I will build my church. The bedrock, therefore, is not Peter, but his confession of Jesus as Christ. The rock that God will establish his church is the confession Peter has just made, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And almost as a reminder of that, he's no longer referred to as Simon Peter, but just Peter. Okay? So this now becomes his new identity, an identity that's built around his confession that Jesus is the Christ. And as Jim was talking about last week, identity is a huge issue for people right now. And if you missed out on that, then please go back and listen to it. It's on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, okay, and listen to that. The Church of England in the news recently said it doesn't have a definition of a woman. Why? Because until recently, it has not needed one. It's been completely self-evident and obvious. But our culture now tells us that we have 72 different defined genders. Okay? And I think this is what happens when you move away from objective truth into subjective truth. And it's very much based around how you feel rather than what is objectively true. And it pervades all sorts of stuff. And I'll give you an example. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, okay, she gave an interview a while back with Oprah Winfrey. Okay, you might have heard of it. Okay, and she said that she grew up as an only child. Okay, except that she didn't. She didn't. She has a half sister who is now suing her for defamation. Okay. And Meghan's lawyers have come back and said that her statement about growing up as an only child was not meant to be objective fact, but a subjective statement around her own feelings. Except she didn't phrase it like that. Okay? And so this is how we get into phrases like my truth. This is my truth. Okay? And it's based around subjective feelings rather than actual objective truth. And there's nothing wrong with some subjective feelings. Nothing wrong with saying, I feel like this. But when we present those feelings as this is, there's a difference. Okay? And so around this whole thing about identity, we are using our subjective feelings to produce our identity. And we're told that we need to discover our identity, to look within ourselves, to search our feelings. And that's a huge pressure for people, actually. It actually feeds into negative mental health because it adds more pressure on people. And I was reading another article by a psychologist who's basically saying, feelings is really unhealthy for people, and it is actually making us our mental health rate spiral, so getting worse. But the good news is, right, that when you proclaim Jesus as Messiah, you have a new identity. You don't need to search within, discover yourself, find yourself. Your identity is formed upon your sonship. In 2 Corinthians 5, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of confusion. So we do need to be gracious and understanding about this because I'm working with young people where I worked with one recently and she just said, she said, I'm transmasculine. And I was like, oh, what's that? And I just had to be really kind of like, she's not someone who knows Jesus. So I can't, you have to kind of journey with them a little bit and kind of go, well, what do you mean by that? And what does that mean? And okay, how do we kind of walk with you in this? And transmasculine, it's just about being a tomboy. That's really what it's about. Okay, it means they identify with some male attributes. Okay, So it's funny, isn't it, how like we talk a lot about fluidity at the minute, gender fluidity, sexual fluidity, but often people are really keen to find a label and find a box. And I think that's because people want identity. But we have an identity that we can offer, and that's an identity in Christ. The fifth one means a new identity means a new purpose. Jesus told Peter that he would give him the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed on heaven. So at first glance, it sounds like Jesus is saying, well, Peter can do whatever you like, okay, and God will honor it, all right? Some sort of amazing authority where he can control heaven. But actually, this is the language of the law court. Jewish legal issues were normally decided in Jesus' day by elders in the synagogue community, okay? And many Jewish people believed that the authority of heaven stood behind earthly judges when they decided cases based on a correct understanding of God's law. And that process came to be called binding and loosing. Okay? And Jesus' contemporaries often envisioned God's justice in terms of a heavenly court. By obeying God's laws, the earthly court simply ratified the decrees of the heavenly court. So in other words, if you're following God's law and you enact on God's law, then and you're doing what God is calling you to do, then heaven kind of ratifies that because you're sort of living in what he's asking you to do. So it's not that the apostles were given this kind of a privilege of changing God's mind as if whatever they decided on earth would just be duplicated in heaven, but rather that they were encouraged that as they move forward in their duties, they would be fulfilling God's plan in heaven. So when they bound something or forbade it on earth, they were carrying out the will of God in the matter. When they loosed something or allowed it on earth, they were fulfilling God's eternal plan. Simply by following Jesus' teachings, and those teachings hinges on the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay? So, when we confess that Jesus is the Christ, then we step into God's plan for our lives. And that means that each one of us is an agent of multiplication ourselves. And this is not something that you do when you're older, more skilled, have more knowledge, get it more, or have it sussed out. Remember, we're talking to Peter, who still didn't fully understand it. Okay? And Jesus does this time and time again. In Luke chapter 10, he sends out a whole load of them out to tell, sends them out to all the little villages to tell them the good news. I didn't even understand the good news properly, okay? Because they didn't understand what Jesus had to do in terms of the cross. They didn't understand the resurrection. That was all still to come. But Jesus still uses them as a role and gives them that purpose of, here you go, off you go, get going with it. And often we disqualify ourselves because we say we're not ready, we don't know enough, we're not skilled enough, we're not gifted enough, we need more time to grow. And actually, that's not Jesus' way. Jesus' way is, I want to use you now. I want to use you now. And so we all have a role in reaching and discipling others. And I think we can do that in our personal lives, but I think we also do that in terms of corporately as a church. And this is where the kind of like how we need to contribute to the life of the church. And I think there are some exciting things changing here. Yes, we're moving venue, but I think it's more than that. There's more things that are going to be coming. And I think, if you're somebody who has just recently joined the church or been part of the church, I would encourage you to ask the question, how could I be involved? How could I contribute to the life of the church here? And if you're not sure how, then you need to come and speak and say, how? How do I do that? How could I get involved? We would love to have more volunteers on a Friday night youth club. But there are lots of things. And maybe you've even got an idea or something that you would think, I'd love to, could I? And so have a conversation with Kira or someone else and say, how can I get involved? What does that look like? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 19 says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. That's us. Okay? You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, declaring the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So 5 things, very quickly, to kind of reach and disciple others. Build long-term relationships. Intentionally create opportunities to explore faith. Seek revelation from God. Offer a new identity and offer a new purpose. Let me pray and then I'll hand back to Claire.